On July 4, 1776, the streets of Philadelphia rang with cheers, cannon fire, and the clinking of glasses as white Americans celebrated the birth of a new nation. Flags waved, speeches were delivered, and fireworks lit up the sky, a spectacular display of liberty and independence. But while the celebrations filled the air with joy, there was another story unfolding in the shadows. Around 500,000 black men, women, and children were in chains, their lives marked not by freedom, but by relentless labor, fear, and exclusion. The liberty so loudly proclaimed was a world they could not touch, a promise made for everyone else. Imagine rising before dawn to tend the fields, cook elaborate meals, or clean homes while the sound of liberty echoed just beyond your reach. Imagine witnessing parades and speeches that celebrated ideals of equality while knowing, deep down, that those very ideals were not meant for you. Independence Day was a day of contradictions, a day when hope and despair coexisted in the hearts of the enslaved and free black communities alike. Some whispered dreams of escape, others quietly resisted through small acts of defiance, and many held on to stories of ancestors and freedom long lost but never forgotten. This is a story rarely told, a perspective that history books often overlook. It is a story of courage, resilience, and quiet rebellion, of people who refused to let chains define their spirit. Today, we bring that history to life, exploring the realities behind the celebrations and the voices that were nearly silenced. If you want to uncover the hidden truths of history, hear the stories of resilience, and celebrate the strength of black communities through time, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that matters. Let us dive into a July 4th, unlike any other, and see the fight for freedom from the perspective of those who were left out. While the Declaration of Independence was being read aloud in city squares and taverns, promising equality and unalienable rights, the reality for black Americans, even those who were legally free, painted a starkly different picture. In northern cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, freedom did not mean safety, opportunity, or recognition of humanity. Free black men might rise early to haul barrels along the docks, clean streets, or serve in taverns where the patrons toasted to liberty. Yet their voices carried no weight in the eyes of the law. Courts refused to hear them as credible witnesses, and the threat of false accusations loomed constantly, a reminder that their freedom was conditional and fragile. Free black women faced an equally unforgiving world, working as cooks, laundresses, or domestic servants for families that could at any moment exploit, harass, or even threaten to sell them into bondage. Independence for them was not a celebration. It was a daily negotiation, a careful balancing act in a society that recognized their freedom on paper but denied it in practice. Even simple acts of mobility or public presence could provoke hostility. Walking through the same streets where white citizens celebrated their liberation, free black individuals were often met with suspicion, mockery, or outright violence. Their mere existence in public spaces challenged a social order that thrived on maintaining racial hierarchy, and for many, that meant constantly adapting, staying vigilant, and performing a form of invisible resistance. Some sought to demonstrate their humanity through skill, work, or service, hoping that diligence might carve out a space of respect, however limited, while others quietly nurtured aspirations that one day freedom could be more than a precarious status dictated by white authority. Beyond labor and law, social exclusion shaped every interaction. Invitations to community events, schools, and religious congregations were often denied, and networks of mutual support became essential for survival. Free black communities formed intricate webs of care, sharing knowledge, resources, and protection, understanding that independence was as much a collective endeavor as an individual achievement. These networks served as incubators for resilience, fostering cultural continuity and moral strength in a world that systematically sought to erase both. Even as the sounds of Independence Day celebrations echoed in the streets, from drumbeats to cannon fire, free black people experienced a layered reality. They were not enslaved, yet their liberties were constantly measured, limited, and contested, a reminder that the promise of the revolution was incomplete and unequal. This tension between nominal freedom and lived experience illuminated the paradox of early America, a nation declaring universal equality while denying its most basic expression to entire populations. Liberty existed as a concept and as a spectacle, but for those outside its protective circle, it was a fragile illusion. In navigating this world, free black men and women displayed remarkable ingenuity, courage, and determination. They preserved their dignity through education, religion, commerce, and cultural expression, quietly challenging the society that refused to grant them full recognition. They bore witness to the hypocrisy of a nation celebrating independence while leaving so many in chains, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for future generations to demand justice, equality, and inclusion. The story of free black life in the North was not one of complacency or passive acceptance. Every day was a testament to endurance. Every act of self-determination, a quiet rebellion against a system built to contain them, whether by building supportive communities, asserting their rights within narrow legal bounds, or passing down traditions and knowledge to children. Free black people carved out spaces of freedom that were theirs to claim, even amid societal structures designed to deny them. This complex reality underscores that liberty, for many, was conditional and precarious, a lesson in resilience and ingenuity that resonates through history, revealing the unspoken struggles that accompanied the birth of a nation whose ideals were not yet universal. As the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, its words promised a world of equality, rights, and liberty, yet those very words carried a hidden betrayal. Thomas Jefferson, who penned the stirring phrase that all men are created equal, did so while owning over 100 enslaved people, some of whom labored on the very plantations where the ideals he wrote of were denied. His original draft condemned the transatlantic slave trade as a vile stain on humanity, yet Southern delegates, whose wealth and power were entwined with human bondage, demanded that passage be removed, and Northern merchants, profiting indirectly from slavery, consented. What remained was a document that celebrated freedom while safeguarding slavery, crafting a vision of liberty that applied fully only to white colonists, leaving black people, both enslaved and free, outside its circle of justice. For the millions of people in bondage, the Declaration's words must have sounded both beautiful and hollow, a public performance of ideals they could never touch, a promise celebrated in city squares while the labor that financed it went unrecognized and unremunerated. Enslaved men and women watched as white Americans hailed their independence, hearing speeches, toasts, and the ringing of bells, all while remaining bound by chains that no revolutionary rhetoric could loosen. The cruel irony was undeniable. Liberty was a spectacle designed to glorify the freedom of a few while enforcing the subjugation of many. Some enslaved people, hearing the language of equality and natural rights, allowed themselves a flicker of hope, imagining that perhaps the revolution could bring change for them too. Yet the reality of deliberate omission in the nation's founding document reinforced that those hopes were misplaced. The Declaration did not acknowledge their humanity, did not recognize their labor, and did not consider the anguish of families divided, lives constrained, and futures stolen. For literate enslaved individuals who somehow accessed the text, the dissonance must have cut sharply. For the illiterate majority, the message was made clear by action rather than words. Freedom was not intended for them. Even free black people experienced the sting of this exclusion. They existed in a precarious space where liberty was conditional, where daily life demanded vigilance and negotiation, where courts, neighborhoods, and social institutions consistently reminded them that their rights were provisional. While white citizens celebrated with parades, music, and feasts, free black men and women often toiled in the lowest-paying jobs, remained subject to legal and social restrictions, and faced constant threats of harassment or false claims that could drag them back into slavery. The Declaration's rhetoric of equality did not translate into opportunity or protection. It was a vision of liberty framed for one group while systematically ignoring another. The contradictions of that day were unmistakable, yet they also sowed the seeds of resistance and future transformation. Enslaved people and free black communities found ways to challenge the system, whether through subtle acts of defiance, cultural preservation, or building networks of mutual aid that nurtured survival and dignity. They quietly observed, learned, and planned, taking the principles of the Declaration even in their incompleteness, and envisioning a world where its promises could be claimed for themselves. The very hypocrisy of a nation celebrating freedom while denying it to millions became a catalyst, a lesson in vigilance and strategy that informed abolitionist thought, organized escape, Cabism's ant, and the relentless pursuit of civil rights in generations to come. In the end, the Declaration's omissions revealed the selective nature of liberty in 1776, highlighting a stark division between ideal and practice, between what was proclaimed and what was enforced. The document was a mirror reflecting the aspirations of a nation, but for black people, it reflected only what was denied, providing both a source of frustration and a spark for future rebellion, for the creation of a vision of freedom that would eventually extend beyond the narrow limits imposed by the founders. The celebration of independence existed alongside bondage, and it was in that tension, in that contrast, that the story of black endurance, hope, and resistance was written quietly, courageously, and indelibly. As the Revolutionary War unfolded, enslaved people found themselves caught in a storm of impossible choices, their futures hanging on decisions made not for them, but around them, in a struggle that promised liberty for some while leaving millions in chains. Across the colonies, rumors spread that the British, seeking to weaken the rebel cause, were offering freedom to any enslaved person willing to escape and join their forces for those who had spent their lives in bondage. This promise was seismic. Men and women quietly weighed the risks of fleeing under the cover of night, navigating forests, vigilante classes, swamps, and hostile territory, driven by the hope of claiming a freedom that had been systematically denied for generations. Some saw in the British offer a path to survival and autonomy, a rare opportunity to seize agency over their own lives. Yet the promise carried enormous danger. Capture meant brutal punishment, and uncertainty shadowed every step, for the British themselves had been complicit in the trade that had enslaved so many. At the same time, others looked to the patriot cause, seeing in the fight for independence a potential, if distant, road to freedom. Initially, the Continental Army hesitated to enlist black soldiers, but as the war stretched on and manpower shortages grew desperate, doors began to open. Some men were promised emancipation in exchange for service, yet even this path was fraught with ambiguity, as victory did not guarantee liberty, and promises made in wartime could vanish in the aftermath of treaties and negotiations. On the battlefield, black men sometimes faced the harrowing reality of fighting on opposite sides, one wearing the red coat of the British with hopes of immediate freedom, the other in patriot blue, risking life and limb for a promise that might never be fulfilled. Each choice was a gamble, shaped by survival instincts, loyalty, fear, and the desire for dignity in a world that refused to recognize their humanity. For many enslaved people who could not leave their plantations, escape to either side was impossible, yet the war still imposed profound moral and physical demands. Resistance took other forms: slow labor in the fields, feigned illness, the deliberate misplacement of tools, and subtle acts of sabotage became ways to reclaim some measure of control in an existence designed to erase agency. Families whispered plans and mapped escape routes in secret, while others preserved African traditions, songs, and stories as acts of cultural survival. Each action, no matter how small, was a rebellion against the system that sought to render them invisible. Even free black individuals watched these choices unfold with both hope and trepidation, understanding that the freedoms they had were tenuous, that society could strip them away at any moment, and that solidarity and careful strategy were essential for survival. The revolutionary landscape forced black people to confront the cruel truth of their exclusion. Liberty was being fought over, but not with them in mind. Each cannon fired for independence, each cheer in a city square, was a reminder of the precariousness of their position, a spectacle that both inspired and mocked their aspirations. Yet even amid uncertainty, enslaved and free black people found ways to assert their agency, whether by escaping, enlisting, resisting in the shadows, or nurturing communities that could survive under oppression. The war, in its chaos and contradiction, highlighted not only the inequality embedded in the promise of freedom, but also the courage, ingenuity, and determination of those who refused to remain passive, who sought liberation on their own terms even when the world offered only peril. In this crucible, the fight for freedom became intensely personal, a negotiation between hope and danger, loyalty and survival. Every choice carried weighty consequences, yet it also illuminated the indomitable human spirit. Enslaved people navigating the promises of the British or the Patriots revealed a truth often overlooked in the story of the Revolution: that liberty was never simple, never guaranteed, and that the struggle to claim it required courage beyond the battlefield, extending into every act of daily resistance, every whispered plan, and every dream of a life that could finally be free. Even as the revolution unfolded around them, enslaved people found ways to assert their humanity in a world designed to deny it, discovering that resistance took many forms, each act a statement of survival and defiance. In the fields, some deliberately slowed their labor, taking extra time to tend crops or complete chores, small yet deliberate gestures that reminded overseers that obedience was never absolute, that their bodies, though bound, could still assert will and control. Tools were sometimes broken or misplaced, sabotaging the work that maintained the wealth and leisure of enslavers, acts that, though quiet and hidden, carried the unmistakable message that freedom, even when forbidden, could not be entirely suppressed. For others, running away under cover of darkness became the ultimate expression of resistance, a dangerous but necessary gamble to seize liberty, guided by knowledge of the land, secret paths, and networks of allies, both black and sympathetic white, who quietly assisted those seeking to escape. Every successful flight was a triumph, every return from the brink a reaffirmation that hope could survive even in the harshest conditions. Resistance was not limited to physical acts. Culture became a sanctuary and a weapon, a way to preserve identity and memory when enslavers sought to erase it. Songs, spirituals, and African melodies carried coded messages of endurance, instructions for escape, and affirmations of self-worth. Storytelling passed down histories, celebrated ancestors, mifted classism, and instilled pride in children, ensuring that, even in bondage, the sense of belonging and heritage remained alive. These cultural practices were often secret, shared only among trusted listeners, yet their impact was profound, allowing enslaved people to maintain a sense of agency in a system determined to strip them of it. Through music and narrative, communities quietly asserted that their lives, their histories, and their dreams could not be stolen, even if the laws claimed ownership over their bodies. Free black communities, though not subjected to chains, faced oppression and marginalization that demanded vigilance and resourcefulness, and their acts of resistance were equally vital. Mutual aid networks formed in cities and towns became lifelines, offering support, education, and protection against the systemic threats that sought to undermine their autonomy. Artisans, sailors, laborers, and small landowners pooled resources, exchanged information, and nurtured social bonds that helped preserve safety and dignity. Churches and clandestine gatherings offered spaces for spiritual sustenance and community organization, reinforcing resilience and creating the foundations of collective action that would later fuel abolitionist movements. Every gathering, every whispered plan, and every cooperative effort was a quiet but powerful rejection of a society built to constrain them, a signal that liberty and justice were not abstractions but achievable goals, even if delayed. In this world of layered oppression, resistance and hope were inseparable. Each act of defiance, whether in the field, in the streets, or within the heart of a household, was a declaration that the human spirit could not be contained. Enslaved and free black people wove survival into everyday life, transforming ordinary moments into opportunities to assert identity, claim dignity, and maintain the possibility of a future free from subjugation. The revolution may have been fought in the name of liberty, yet for black Americans, it became a reminder of how precarious and conditional freedom could be, and yet it also illuminated their power to resist, to endure, and to hope, through generations. Felicity, these acts of resistance slowed labor, sabotage, escape, cultural preservation, and community solidarity accumulated into a legacy of resilience, demonstrating that even when the world refused to grant freedom, black people found ways to claim it for themselves. Each small rebellion was a spark that, over time, ignited larger movements for emancipation and civil rights, proving that courage, ingenuity, and unity could withstand even the most relentless oppression. In this tapestry of survival and defiance, resistance was not merely reactionary. It was visionary, planting seeds of liberty and justice that would bloom across the centuries, transforming a day that excluded them into a platform for asserting their humanity and shaping the promise of freedom for future generations. As the years passed, the story of July 4th evolved for Black Americans, transforming from a day that once symbolized exclusion and oppression into a platform for resistance, empowerment, and the pursuit of equality. What began in 1776 as a celebration of liberty for some became, for generations of Black families, a reminder of the work still to be done, the chains still to be broken, and the promise of freedom still deferred. Yet even in the face of systemic injustice, enslaved and free Black people refused to remain passive. They carried forward the spirit of defiance in quiet, determined ways. So, teaching their children about dignity, identity, and the courage required to claim what was theirs by right, through acts as subtle as shared stories, coded songs, and whispered plans, they preserved not only their survival, but their vision of a world where liberty could be real, tangible, and accessible to all. Over time, those seeds of quiet resistance blossomed into organized efforts, as abolitionists, activists, and community leaders leveraged the language of independence itself to challenge the nation to live up to its ideals. Frederick Douglass, 70 decades later, would famously ask, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" pointing to the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated freedom while millions remained in bondage. Yet even his searing critique was part of a larger legacy, a tradition of using the rhetoric of 1776 as a tool for justice. Black Americans harnessed the very promises that had once ignored them, turning the ideals of equality, liberty, and unalienable rights into instruments for demanding change, whether through petitions, legal challenges, or the formation of mutual aid societies. Every act, whether small or monumental, demonstrated that the fight for freedom was ongoing, deeply personal, and profoundly transformative. In communities across the nation, July 4th began to carry layered meaning. It became a day not only to acknowledge the exclusion of the past, but also to celebrate the resilience, ingenuity, and achievements of Black Americans. Families gathered, not just to commemorate history, but to nurture education, community solidarity, development, and pride. Churches and cultural institutions provided spaces for reflection, teaching, and empowerment, emphasizing the importance of heritage, identity, and collective memory. What was once a day of alienation transformed into a day of affirmation, a reminder that the ideals of liberty and equality were not fixed, but living principles that could be claimed, redefined, and fought for. This long arc from bondage and exclusion to resistance, cultural survival, and activism illustrates the enduring strength of Black Americans and the profound impact of their courage. July 4th, a day that began as a celebration of freedom denied to millions, ultimately became a platform for amplifying voices that were once silenced, for turning the rhetoric of independence into a call for justice, and for asserting that equality is not granted but demanded. Thank you for joining us in this reflection on the untold stories of July 4th and the resilience of Black Americans who, through courage, hope, and perseverance, reshaped history and the meaning of freedom. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss powerful stories of history, culture, and the fight for justice that mainstream narratives often overlook. Together, we can honor these voices, remember the lessons of the past, and continue the work of turning promises into reality.